Welcome to this explainer. Now, what you're looking at right now, it's not some dystopian movie set. This is actually Tokyo in 1945, firebombed to ruins with people just struggling to survive these incredibly harsh winters. It was, without a doubt, one of the absolutely bleakest, worst places on Earth to try and start a business. And yet, inside a severely damaged office building, right in the middle of falling ash and total devastation, two brilliant engineers, Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuka, were quietly setting the stage for a complete revolution. They shared this fierce, undeniable passion for technology and a dream to build a company where engineers could just work to their absolute heart's content.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the journey from those literal ashes to a $100 billion global empire, it was anything but a straight line. In fact, their very first products were absolute disasters. Like, Ibuka tried creating an electric rice cooker, right? But it either served up crunchy, raw grains or just completely burned them to a crisp. Oh, and then came an electric heating blanket that was basically a walking fire hazard. But they absolutely refused to quit. Believing every single failure was just a stepping stone, they finally found their foothold repairing radios whose long-distance wires had been severed by the government during the war. Funded by an initial investment of just 190,000 yen from Morita's 300-year-old family brewing business, who, by the way, graciously let him break centuries of tradition, they officially incorporated. They had a team, they had a little bit of cash, now they just needed to change the world.
So, their major turning point? It actually started with a profound moment of humiliation. In 1952, after ruthlessly negotiating to license this revolutionary new transistor technology from the United States, Morita was traveling back home. A waiter in a restaurant served him a dessert adorned with one of those tiny paper cocktail umbrellas and laughingly pointed out that it was made in Japan. Now, the waiter meant to be amusing, but Morita? He felt this crushing sense of shame. You see, at the time, made in Japan was totally synonymous with cheap, throwaway trinkets. This single fleeting moment ignited a burning purpose within him. He returned home absolutely determined to redefine what made in Japan meant to the entire globe.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they tackled their branding. If they were going to mass-produce these cutting-edge transistor radios and literally take over the global market, they couldn't exactly stick with their original, clunky corporate name, Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation. I mean, it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, right? They needed something catchy, something completely universal. Flipping through dictionaries, they found the Latin word for sound, sonus, and brilliantly combined it with the American slang for a bright young man, sunny. The result? Sony. It was short, super easy to pronounce in any language, and it perfectly captured their youthful, audio-focused ambition.
So armed with a snappy new name, they set out to make the world's smallest transistor radio. The only problem? Mass-producing transistors was incredibly difficult. Early on, a staggering 95% of their transistors were defective. 95%! It almost bankrupted the young company. But they pushed through, tweaking and refining their process until they released the TR-63 in 1957. They proudly marketed it as the world's first pocket-sized radio. Now, there was a slight catch. The radio was actually just a tiny bit too big to fit into a standard shirt pocket. So, showing some incredible marketing savvy and honestly a great sense of humor, Sony literally manufactured custom salesman shirts with slightly oversized pockets. When the salesman demonstrated it, the radio slid in perfectly. The illusion totally worked. The product was a massive hit, and Sony was off to the races.
While Morita was busy expanding over into the US market, Ibuka was back in the lab, pouring his absolute soul into an impossible task, reinventing color television. Early color TVs were dim, they were blurry, and horribly expensive. Ibuka absolutely refused to just tweak existing technology. He demanded his engineers build it entirely from scratch. This led to some disastrous early prototypes that had to be sold at massive losses. But Ibuka's relentless perfectionism finally birthed the Trinitron. It was so impossibly bright and sharp that it actually won an Emmy Award. And the result? A staggering 290 million Trinitron sets sold over the coming decades. That is an enormous number. It cemented their reputation for premium quality and finally, beautifully, fulfilled Morita's dream of making Made in Japan a true mark of absolute excellence.
But you know, in business, invincibility is an illusion. In 1975, Sony introduced Betamax, this revolutionary device that allowed you to record live television. It was like magic at the time. But they very quickly found themselves in a brutal format war against a rival technology called VHS. It was your classic tech dilemma. Betamax undeniably had the superior image quality. It was technically the far better machine. But VHS was cheaper, and more importantly, the tapes could hold 4 times as much video. For the average consumer just looking to record a whole football game or a couple of movies, VHS simply made way more sense. Sony lost millions in this format war, learning a really hard lesson that the best technology doesn't always win if it doesn't match everyday consumer behavior.
Bleeding money from that tough Betamax defeat, Morita made an incredibly audacious bet. He traveled constantly and absolutely hated not having his music with him. So he pitched this wild idea, a portable cassette player you could listen to with headphones. His own executives thought he was out of his mind. At the time, wearing headphones in public in Japan was considered somewhat shameful. It was typically associated only with hearing impairments. Plus, the device couldn't even record audio. But Morita was so incredibly certain this would change how the world consumed media that he put his own career on the line. He declared, if it doesn't sell 30,000 units, I'll quit. Well, spoiler alert, he didn't have to quit. The Sony Walkman completely redefined personal entertainment, selling a mind-boggling 385 million units.
And this brilliantly illustrates the next major evolution of Sony. They realized that hardware alone just wasn't enough anymore. Teaming up with Philips, they spent 14 years developing a completely digital audio format, the compact disc. They invested $30 million into a factory, which was a massive risk at the time, but it created this perfect self-sustaining loop. Think about it. Sony manufactured the CDs. They collected royalties from other companies using the format. They sold the hardware, the CD players, and finally, through their new record label, they sold the music from massive artists printed on those very CDs. Every time one stream grew, it automatically fed the others. It was a flawless, highly lucrative financial snowball. That CD snowball, it generated absolutely staggering profits. Sony was no longer just some electronics manufacturer, they were an unstoppable media force. In 1988, they used this massive influx of cash to outright purchase CBS Records for a cool $2 billion. This huge move secured them the master catalogs of musical titans like Bob Dylan and Michael Jackson. Today, that acquisition has evolved into Sony Music Entertainment, which is the second largest record label on the entire planet. So they had successfully conquered the music industry. Naturally, they started looking for their next big target, video games.
Now, in the early 90s, Sony actually partnered with Nintendo to create a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. It seemed like a match made in heaven. But Nintendo started growing paranoid. They feared that if games shifted from traditional cartridges over to CDs, Sony might eventually steal their developers and just completely take over the market. So in a truly shocking move, Nintendo publicly humiliated Sony. They announced they were ditching Sony to partner with Philips, the very company Sony had co-created the CD with. Oh man, the executives at Sony were utterly furious. It was a deep, deep personal betrayal.
But you do not stab a company like Sony in the back without consequences. Driven by absolute vengeance, Sony took the technology they were developing for Nintendo and just launched it themselves in 1994 as the PlayStation. Because it used CDs, developers suddenly had vastly more storage space to create these huge, incredibly ambitious 3D games compared to the severely limited cartridges of the Nintendo 64. Sony absolutely crushed their former partner. The original PlayStation went on to sell over 100 million units, launching legendary franchises and cementing Sony as the undisputed new king of the console wars. No question about it.
So the crucial point here is that the PlayStation era fundamentally rewired Sony's corporate brain. They saw firsthand that owning the intellectual property, the exclusive game characters, the music catalogs, the actual content running on their devices was the ultimate business advantage. Sony transformed from a single electronics company into this massive, multi-headed hydra expanding far, far beyond TVs and radios. They bought Columbia Pictures to conquer movies, they expanded into banking, life insurance, biotechnology, and even advanced robotics and electric cars. They were no longer just making the TV, they were financing the movies playing on it and literally ensuring the people watching it.
This incredible hunger for intellectual property led to what might honestly be the greatest heist in Hollywood history. In 1998, Marvel Comics was fresh out of a brutal bankruptcy, and they were absolutely desperate for cash. Sony Pictures swooped in and bought the exclusive movie rights to Marvel's absolute crown jewel, Spider-Man, for a measly $7 million. Guys, $7 million is literal pennies in the movie business. And the deal stated that as long as Sony releases a Spider-Man movie every 5 years and 9 months, they hold those rights forever. To date, that tiny $7 million investment has generated nearly $9 billion in box office revenue for Sony. Just unbelievable.
However,
This incredible victory actually hides one of the most hilariously bad decisions in corporate history. During those 1998 negotiations, Marvel was so desperate that they actually offered Sony the cinematic rights to almost all of their characters. I'm talking Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, everyone, for just $25 million. But a Sony executive famously pushed the deal away, stating point blank, nobody cares about the other Marvel characters. So they only bought Spider-Man. Knowing the tens of billions of dollars the Marvel Cinematic Universe went on to generate, yeah, that boardroom rejection has got to sting just a little bit.
But honestly, missed opportunities were nothing compared to the crisis that hit them in 2014. Sony employees arrived at work to find their computers completely taken over by a hacker group calling themselves the Guardians of Peace. Terabytes of highly sensitive data were wiped or stolen. We're talking unreleased films and deeply embarrassing internal executive emails, just out there for the world to see. The US government officially attributed this devastating cyber attack to North Korea, citing it as retaliation for the Sony comedy The Interview. Now, looking at this objectively, it is important to note that some prominent cybersecurity experts remain highly skeptical of that official North Korean attribution, pointing to evidence of a potential inside job. But regardless of who actually pulled the trigger, it stands as one of the most severe corporate hacks in history.
Yet through literal fires, brutal format wars, corporate betrayals, and massive cyber attacks, the Hydra just simply grows another head. Sony has never, ever stopped taking risks. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Look around your house right now. Whether it's your television, the music streaming through your headphones, the blockbuster movie you watched last weekend, or that game console sitting right under your TV, what would your living room, and honestly your entire digital life look like today if two ambitious engineers hadn't decided to start repairing broken radios in the falling ashes of 1945 Tokyo? It's pretty incredible to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep your curiosity sharp.